Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kutin.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Our guests today are here to discuss Malaysia's generation endgame for smoking. Health Minister Kari Jamaluddin has announced that there are plans to permanently prohibit anyone born after January 1st, 2005 from purchasing smoking products, and that includes cigarettes, vape, electronic cigarettes, cigars, shisha and the like. Now, close to half of all Malaysian men light up, and tobacco is said to be responsible for about a fifth of cancer cases in Malaysia. But there's also those who argue or see the endgame as excessive a state intervention or even too idealistic to be implemented successfully. Here to discuss this further, we have Dr. Helmi Hajamaidin. He is a consultant respiratory physician at Pantai Hospital. He's also the technical advisor to the Health Ministry on tobacco control. We also have Datuk Sri Idris Jala, Pemandu Associate CEO and President. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show. Appreciate your time being here. I'd like to maybe begin our conversation by stating that both of you agree that smoking is bad and harmful, and that reducing Malaysia's tobacco use is a good thing. But I want to focus on where you see the gaps in the generation endgame. What would keep it from being implemented successfully? Idris, if I may start with you.
I think the first thing that you need to do, first of all, I would say that I support the minister's approach, YB Khairi's approach of the endgame. I absolutely believe that's the right thing to do. But the path to get there is the thing that we need to figure out. And the good news is that when you look around the world, there are many countries that have made leaps and bounds in reducing the prevalence of smoking, tobacco in the world. And so we're not going to do this path lonely. And we have to learn from the UK and New Zealand and Japan. So we don't have to start figuring out how to do it. We look at how they've done it. And so we look at the statistics. There's massive reduction in tobacco prevalence. So we can learn from them, basically. So we can go into a bit more detail what I think is the gaps. And basically, I want us to learn from doing that. I would say these are the pathfinders. And we can achieve that, the target that the government is put forward out there. And it's very important that we do so. That's the stats, as you pointed out. There are so many deaths that's coming out from smoking, if you like. The estimate is 4 people die every year globally per second.
From smoking related.
From smoking. And so there are altogether 13.1 billion people in the world. They're suffering from all sorts of things that are connected with. 1.3 billion are the ones who are smokers of the total population.
Dr. Helmi, just to follow up on that, do you think that the generational endgame can be successful?
Yes, I think it can be successful. Excuse me. But I think, to take a step back, the generational endgame is meant to be just one component of the Tobacco and Smoking Control Act that we are hoping to introduce in the next parliamentary sitting. So there's been a lot of media attention, lots of headlines about the endgame on its own, but it's meant to be a more holistic act, a more holistic bill that looks into various different factors. Because as Dr. Sri was mentioning earlier on, the underlying, I suppose, goal, the philosophy behind this is to get people to not smoke, but also to get people to stop smoking. So there are going to be elements within it with regards to how to help people to stop smoking, because it's not meant to penalize, it's not meant to be just punitive, it's also meant to be helpful and to be encouraging. And as with a lot of things that come when you're dealing with addiction, it's not just about stopping things, it's also about preventing things. So the generational endgame element is meant to be there to help reduce the risk or the prevalence of people starting to smoke, but there are other elements to it, because unfortunately, in the Malaysian setting, a lot of our laws when it comes to smoking and vaping are quite archaic. We're going back to laws that were made decades ago, and at this point in time, for example, when it comes to electronic cigarettes, we are in a bit of a legal limbo as with the definition of what things are. So there's a lot of things that need to be put in place. So the Act is meant to address these gaps. So yes, we are focused on the generational endgame, but it's just one part of a bigger whole.
Idris, there are people who look at this and see the government overreach. They see a policy that's based on the notion that the state knows best when it comes to personal choices, and something like health is a deeply personal choice. It's not just tobacco that kills people. Too much sugar might kill you. A lack of exercise might kill you. Red meat will probably kill you too. But we have this, in some sense, an obsession with smoking. And rightly so. Do you think there is a middle way? All the kinds of restrictions we see around the world, but that don't take away choice from the individual.
I see it like this. You can divide the 180 countries who are signatory to the WHO framework for control of tobacco, take them into two groups. Group one are those who see the world as black and white. And they have two pillars of their strategy. That means to say that if you don't smoke, don't start. If you smoke, stop. That's where they put it, very black and white. To your point about the choices, the second group are the ones that said, let's three pillars. If you don't smoke, don't start. If you smoke, stop. But if you can't stop, then switch to the alternatives. That's about choice. And so if I look at the countries that have made tremendous progress in reducing prevalence, those countries that follow the second approach, I call them the pragmatists. These are very pragmatic people that say that not everybody can stop. And so you give them choices so that they can transition from smoking to less harmful products, which is the e-cigarette, which is less harmful. So that's the choice that you referred to, is that's what they were doing. So if you take the case of UK, the UK have been able to reduce their, per year, the reductions are more than 4% reduction per year. New Zealand and Japan is about 3.4% per year. Today, the prevalence of cigarette in the country is already below 14% and 13%. And we are already still at 21% in Malaysia. So WHO had said, if we continue on the current path, we will only reach 15% tobacco prevalence by the year 2042. So we really have to find a new pathway to get that reduction down. And for me, the good news is that we don't have to reinvent the wheels. We got to pick from countries that have made the progress, and it can be done. So I do agree with you. In doing it, we have to make the choices quite clear to people. And Dr. Helmi had said right from the beginning, we have to educate people to prevent them from starting to smoke. The education is important in schools, in universities, to educate people, and enough awareness is important.
But okay, so if I push this to Helmi, right, there has been decades-long education programs on, but there is something in the human spirit that wants to do things that are not necessarily good for them, that derive pleasure, deep pleasure from things like smoking. Are you saying to them that, and especially that generation that's going to be barred from this, that they have no right to make that choice?
As with anything that is harmful to the body, you want to make it difficult for people to obtain it. There will not be a perfect law where it's going to be implemented perfectly, and I can't say, for example, that this is going to be perfectly implemented, that it will definitely get 100% of the goals. But we can make things more difficult for people to get. So let's say heroin, for example. Heroin is something that I've been informed, with no personal experience, that's very pleasurable, right? It gives you a bit of a dopamine kick. It takes you to places where you've never been before. But it's not something that you can buy from 7-Eleven. It's not something that you can buy, from the street, unless you're dealing with someone who's doing it illegally. So we have laws that restrict these things, and we try, as we know from more recent evidence, we are trying not to be too punitive, because we know that users are not the problem here. People get addicted for many different reasons. There's genetics, there's neurobiology, there's the biopsychosocial elements as to why someone becomes addicted. So yes, one, we want to restrict these substances that are going to potentially make people addicted, because to me, tobacco is different from the red meat you mentioned, the alcohol, the sugar, because there isn't a safe amount of cigarettes that you can consume, right? It's not like sugar. There is a safe amount that, in fact, there is a necessary amount for you to stay alive. And the concern rightly pointed out by many individuals is that if you are starting to restrict things in one area, it's going to be a bit of a downward cycle, a downward, what should we call it?
A slippery slope.
A slippery slope whereby everything else is going to come into play and going to control things. Now, I don't think that's the case. And me as a doctor, as someone who is involved with this particular issue, I see tobacco very differently. Perhaps I am a bit obsessed about it, but it is partly because I deal with the consequences of it on a daily basis. And you see how it affects not just individuals, but families and loved ones. So I think there is an element in which, unfortunately, yes, we are going to infringe on some rights, but based on public health knowledge, based on things that I think are very justifiable. And I would argue that this is not something that's automatically transmittable to other substances, such as food or alcohol, for example.
Okay. Well, what about what Idris pointed out, that missing step of, for those who cannot quit, then there are harm reduction strategies of switching to vape or e-cigarettes. Is that scientifically, is there scientific evidence that shows that this is a successful harm reduction strategy?
So when it comes to getting people off smoking, I totally agree. It's very, very difficult for people to quit. Some people can quit cold turkey. Some people can quit and then unfortunately take about 10 times before they quit completely.
Right.
And there are various different elements as to why that happens. So one of the things that we don't always talk about and we don't really provide is actually psychological support. So, that is one key thing that's very, very important, because once again, addiction is not just about the physiological substance that you're taking, but the psychological elements behind it, why people get addicted, why people reach out for these substances. There are products that are more scientifically proven, so things like nicotine replacement therapy, that we want to make more readily available. So for example, a couple of weeks ago, we got into a situation, or rather we got into an agreement with Jakim where MQuit or cigarette cessation services are available at mosque for people to use that as part of the more holistic approach. And once again, is to show that we're not being punitive about things. Electronic cigarettes, there's also the devices that you can heat but not combust.
Right.
So these are
Heat
different
not
types.
burn, right?
Heat not burn, that's the one. So there are all these different things that that are being shown or are being portrayed as something that's less harmful, that can be an alternative. But if we were to look at it from a very strictly medical point of view, we can only prescribe or suggest these things if the evidence is sound. Now, I would argue that at this point in time, the evidence isn't robust enough for us to conclusively say that, you know what, instead of taking this, you take this and you'll be fine. So I think it goes back to what...
But if the evidence isn't robust enough to say it's sound, is it robust enough to ban it completely?
There is sufficient evidence to say that it is dangerous to you. So if, for example, you were to inhale something that contains the normal chemicals that you get from electronic cigarettes, for example, there are carcinogens in it, there are chemicals or inhalants that can, for example, trigger asthma. We've got this situation called EVALI, where there's basically a very, very aggressive form of fibrosis that affects the lungs. So these are things that we know are harmful, and we're seeing a kind of re-emergence of what happened with tobacco itself, with smoking itself back from the 60s, where we see lots of initial data from in vitro studies. We see initial acute events in patients. What we don't know yet is the long-term effects, because bear in mind, even for tobacco, things like your cancers, you only see it 20, 30 years down the line.
May I jump inside there? There's a question about cigarette. Conventional cigarette, there are total research that's shown about 10,000 chemicals that are in when you burn a cigarette and smoke it. But if you don't burn it, the combustion aspect of it, 95% of those 10,000 harmful chemicals is removed. But the fact of the matter is there's still a 5% that's harmful. That's why from a clinical standpoint, the argument is always, although you remove 95% of the harmful chemicals, there's still 5% there. But the point is, you cannot say they are not harmful. They are harmful, but it's still less. So the point that I made with Sharad before is that you give people the awareness that the choice is that either if you smoke, if you can't stop, then switch to the less harmful. The studies that were shown in the UK, this is last year's study, 2021, the Public of England Health study showed that people who switch from smoking conventional cigarette to what's called electronic nicotine delivery system ENDS, or the equivalent of e-cigarette, and when they quit, they switch over to there, the quit rate from smoking permanently is a 59.7% in 4 weeks. This is the Public Health of England report 2021. Now they also say, to Helmi's point, If you use electronic nicotine cigarette to do it, in addition to prescribed medical help, and such as the nicotine replacement therapy that Dr. Helmi referred to, the Public of England study shows that the quit rate for the same period of 4 weeks rise to 60% to 74%. So if you add that to this, but if you do it alone by yourself, that means you do prescribe only the nicotine replacement therapy by itself, it is not as effective. So you need to put both together if you do. But if you do it alone by itself, it will already reduce it will improve.
I know you want to respond to that, but we're going to go for a quick break. But let's come back and then you can respond to what Idris has just said. We'll come back and continue this conversation with Idris Jalla and Dr. Helmi Hajamaidin in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned to Consider This. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. With me is Sharad Kutan. Our guests today are discussing the generation endgame for smoking that has been proposed for Malaysia. Dr. Helmi Hajamaidin, consultant respiratory physician at Pantai Hospital, and Dr. Sri Idris Jalla, CEO of Pemandu Associates. Helmi, you wanted to respond to Idris.
I was just going to ask Dr. Sri, if based on what you said, do you think it would be a better idea if electronic cigarettes, vapes, or even the non-combustible items are then only available as a prescription? Because if you're thinking of it in terms of a harm reduction tool, so rather than allowing it to be available in the retail space, be very strict and be very...
Yeah, in the experience in the best practice countries I referred to, the UK and Japan and also New Zealand, if you do that, your quit rate is not as high as if you were to allow the combined approach as well as singular approach for switching.
But then you're kind of having your cake and, you know, wanting your cake and having it too.
The fact of the matter is this. You just have to look at the facts. Which country has been successful in reducing it?
I would also argue...
Can I just sort of, I know because this conversation is very important and I hope policymakers do debate this, and the question is maybe, perfect can be the enemy of the good, as they say. And I do want to say, come back to your analogy about heroin, because it's very striking, but I think it's wrong in this regard. We ban heroin for everybody. What the end game suggests is banning it for part of the adult population and not for the other. And there are tremendous contradictions in that. Legal, constitutional, philosophical, and social, I think, most importantly. And I think whether policymakers are realistic in understanding what they are creating, it sounds very good, intentions are great, but will it in fact create more problems than it solves? Idris.
You have raised a very fundamental point about choices. And I do believe that in life we have to give people the choices. But when they make the choice, they have to have the right information available. That means education, so that they know how to make the right choices. I think in ignorant countries where people don't give them the right information, they make the wrong choices because they don't know. So in a society like ours, while we allow people the choices that they make, they need to be given enough education or information about the facts of the case, and all the research is available. In Malaysia, for example, I cited a lot of examples of quite a lot of research that were done in other countries. People say, yeah, fine, Idris, you can refer to the UK, but it's not here. So while we do this, it's also important to do research here, so that people then say, we've done research among the cohorts in Malaysia or trace it over a period of time. Then people begin to be convinced by the scientific data that's available.
But you also know that people have all the information and they will still make a choice that is different.
Yeah.
When you talk about choice, you cannot say this is the right choice and the wrong choice.
Yeah, sure.
Philosophically, people have a right to make the trade-offs in their lives. And that is something I want to ask you, Helmi. When you talk to your patients, perhaps when they have cancer and it's definitely from smoking, maybe they regret it. But would you say that doctors are in a position to micromanage people's lives, tell them that they ought to and restrict the choices they make?
I think once again, you are taking this and then you're making the assumption that it's going to apply to every other element of medicine as well. And you know, I'll be the first to admit that doctors can be a bit paternalistic at times. You know, don't do this, do that, and then we go off and have a burger, right? So you know, there can be some contradiction there. But once again, okay, I think if we could spend hours debating the philosophy behind it, and even the concept of doing what's right for the individual. So you know, let's say, is it someone's right to marry a child? You could argue it is, right? Because people can make that choice. The child who is 17 years old or 16 years old may argue that they have a choice to make because they are, you know, they are fully aware of what's going on. But we would argue, or I would argue at least, that child marriage should be made illegal, right? You want to use different examples instead of heroin. And I know you want to talk about the difference in age or that generation band being just specific for one particular group. Now, that is going back to what Dr. Sri was talking about earlier about being pragmatic. You're never going to be able to ban something that's been with human beings for centuries. You're never going to be able to get rid of it completely. So the next best thing is to then do it in stages. And once again, you're absolutely right. There is a fundamental question about infringement of an individual's liberty. Is this constitutional? And this is where our more learned colleagues from the AGC, for example, we have consulted with them. We've consulted with constitutional experts from University Malaya, for example, and they all agree that there is an argument for it. So if you want to go down into the legalities of it, that I'm not the best person to argue with you about that or debate with you about that, but we are very cognizant of it. And because of that, we get the opinions and the more advanced legal knowledge from other individuals as well.
Okay. What about, because I'm quite interested in what Idris said about the quit rate, right? So moving from, say, e-cigarettes into eventually quitting smoking altogether. And that is the dream, to have a smoke-free nation, a smoking-free nation. But there is a psychology of nicotine addiction that we need to address in order to make all of this a success. What are some of the behavioral, social and cultural issues that need to be addressed and looked at? You talked about communication, but it is so much more than that. It is also part of the question of choice, as we mentioned. In the last few minutes that we have left, Idris, maybe you can, and Dr. Helmi, what do both of you want to have, to policymakers to be cognizant of when they are crafting this policy that takes into account the behavior of nicotine addiction?
Two things. I will refer to my own experience. I used to be a chain smoker. I smoked until I reached a point I was smoking 2.5 packs a day. Then I wanted to stop smoking. I have a medical reason why I stopped. But at that point, I made a decision not to smoke. But there's so many people, my friends, who cannot do cold turkey because the addiction is very difficult to kick. And so if you want to kick it out completely, it's very difficult to do cold turkey. What I've seen, the examples where it's successful is that giving people a choice to move from smoking to a less harmful alternative. And then if there are medical help that's available, they can go there and get it. And that's, I think, a very, very important aspect of giving the choice. And I do agree with you, but you have to educate people so that they have the facts of the case. But you can't legislate against everything and make people comply with your requirement. That's life. I say if you want to be philosophical about it, there's a point when the government can say this is good for you, but then they like parents. The parents can tell you, my son and daughter, this is good and this is bad for you. At the end of the day, at some point they have to make their own choices. And it's very difficult to legislate for everything. But you can tell them what's good or not good.
Dr. Ham.
So a couple of things. One, it is not always straightforward. It is not cigarette, alternative, and then quit. If you look at all the studies, and especially studies that are also done in Malaysia, it's usually cigarettes, alternative mixed with cigarettes, alternative mixed with other stuff, alternatives going back to cigarettes, and then perhaps there are cases, of course, where they quit as well, and it works the other way around as well. The major concern in the United States, for example, is how you go from nothing to e-cigarettes, and then you start using cigarettes. So it's not as straightforward as this is better or this is less harmful, therefore it's going to work. And that's why when it comes to policy making, it's a bit more tricky. And it goes back to what both of you were saying, where when we are dealing or we are creating policy, we have to be cognizant of these various elements. We need to introduce an element of choice. But to me, the overarching thing is, at the end of the day, I also want to make sure that people are given the support to quit. And it's not just about being punitive, it's also about being supportive.
All right. Okay, gentlemen, thank you so much for being on the show tonight. We appreciate your time and you sharing your perspectives. That was our conversation with Dr. Helmi Hajabaidin and Idris Jala. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttin, signing off with you.
Thank you so much for watching and good night.